this lesson we're going to look at voting systems, and we're going to look at the right to vote, or the franchise meaning the right to vote. We're going to look at how voting systems might be improved, how elections work and how they take place, and different voting systems and evaluating different voting systems. What you're going to need to know at the end of this lesson is essentially a evaluative understanding of the arguments for proportional representation or fair voting systems and different voting systems, at least 3 comparative voting systems, and obviously you need to understand what first past the post is and how it works and what its strengths and weaknesses, which we'll explore in a moment. So hopefully by the end of this lesson we'll have looked at voting systems and their strengths and weaknesses. The story of the franchise, or the right to vote, is surprisingly similar in large democracies. I mean, women get the vote in this country in 1928 on the same basis as men. And it's really about that time that most democracies are giving women the vote. I mean, there are some outliers, certain American states, I forget which, Oregon, certain parts of the British Empire, where women are getting voting earlier in the 19th century. But essentially Germany, France, the big democracies, the United States, women are getting the vote in the early 20th century. I mean, there's a period of time I think the early 20th century. Men get the vote in this country stage by stage through the 19th century. So in 1832 there is the Great Reform Act that gives some more men, a very small number of men, the vote. I think it was 1867, let me just check my date there. Yeah, well, I was right. 1867, 1884, 1918, 1928, women get the vote on the same basis as men. But actually from 1832, where very few men can vote, only substantial property owners can vote up until 1832. And 1832 is called the Great Reform Act because it is an acknowledgement that an extension of the franchise can at least be tried. And it also sorts out a lot of anomalous things known as the rotten boroughs, where there are bits of England basically represented by MPs where nobody lives. Through the 19th century, men get the vote, increasingly lowering the qualification for property. That's interesting, isn't it? What's the thinking behind the idea that property and voting should somehow be linked? You can see this going right the way through into the 20th century with Mrs. Thatcher and her kind of property-owning democracy, the selling off of council houses. Property roots people to their country. Property gives people a more conservative attitude. They're more afraid of change. Property creates stability. The people to be most feared are the property-owning, the non-property owners, the propertyless mass. For a start, they tend to be a mass. More people have nothing. The people with nothing have nothing to lose. Won't they simply, if they're given the vote to steal other people's property, to have it taken away from them, vote for free beer and no taxes and take away the property? So the fear of the mass, the fear of the propertyless mass, is very substantial. Particularly in the 19th century, something's operating in the minds of British people, or the British establishment I should say, and that's the French Revolution. It's looming over British history is the French Revolution. The lessons from the French Revolution, the horrifying images of the mob, the great unwashed mob storming palaces. And on the other hand, the consequences of absolutism. That possibly one of the reasons for the mob and the French Revolution is a failure to acknowledge a dispersal of power. So democracy offers the possibility of a dispersal of power. It offers the acknowledging of binding more people into your society, creating more cohesive, avoiding the French Revolution. And yet there's an overall fear of the horrors of the mob. Well, the horrors of the mob really don't men don't get the vote equally over the age of 21 until 1928. The last property qualifications disappear, along with women being given the vote on the same basis as men in 1928. So Britain sort of lets the fizz out slowly. When you're looking at the British Constitution and you want to see one of its strengths, you might see this organic way of evolving, avoiding explosive revolutions. Britain seems to avoid revolutions and transform from a dominant monarchy to a constitutional monarchy and democracy peacefully. Well, that notwithstanding the Peterloo massacre and the giant demonstrations of the Chartists and the rather harsh restrictions of governments on the population after the French Revolution in this country. So I mean, it's not an easy road, to be honest. So just saying we peacefully transfer that tends to be a rather warm glow of British history. But we certainly avoided the horrors of the French Revolution. Do you need to be explained why the attitudes to women delayed women getting the vote across the world, and why it still delays equal treatment of women across the world today? Well, when we look at feminism, we'll explore that. So if you want to look at one of the political ideas, we will explore along with the possibilities of nationalism. We'll look at feminism, and I'll look at that later. The bulk of this lesson is going to be about more practical things. It's about how we could improve democracy. And one of the ways that we could improve democracy is simply reforming the voting system. It will be largely understood that first past the post will be considered unfair. And so there'll be a number of reformed voting systems that might replace it. And indeed, ways in which reformed voting systems have been used in different parts of the UK, particularly in the devolved areas of the UK. Other things have been done to improve democracy. So briefly, let's just sort of tidy up a couple of the smaller things. So let's look at the use of petitions and the use of recall petitions. Okay, recall petitions. In 2015, the Recall Act was voted in. So remember, 2015, that's towards the end of the coalition. The Liberals are in power with the Conservatives. The Liberals are enthusiasts for constitutional reform and the extension of democracy in ways that empower people to be involved in politics. Any extension of democracy answers, to some extent, the democratic deficit, i.e. there's not enough democracy, answers the participation crisis, i.e. people aren't taking part enough. So why not give people the chance to sack their MPs, to remove politicians from power, initiated from below? And the model is the United States. In the United States, citizens can initiate petitions, and petitions can result in fresh elections, which can remove the governor of California, Gray Davis, and the current governor of California, Gavin Newsom, might be removed. Gray Davis was removed and replaced by the actor and Republican Arnold Schwarzenegger. So, recall, sack. If I went out onto the street and I asked people, should we be able to sack our MPs? We might well get a very positive response, a generalised view that politicians are up to no good, and if they're certainly not fulfilling and the main reason we might think of, if they're simply not doing those things that we thought they should do. In other words, politicians, the biggest problem we have with politicians is a sense that they say things to get elected and then don't do them or do something else. Should we be able to sack our MPs? Well, on the American basis, initiated from below wasn't what the British did in 2015. The Petitions Act of 2015, the Recall Act of 2015, creates a process where the Speaker of the House of Commons decides. And it creates a fairly narrow criteria for getting rid of an MP. They have to have been convicted of something to put them in prison. They have to have cheated appallingly on their expenses. And of course the expenses scandal, and if you want to Google the expenses scandal, the fact that MPs in this country, large numbers of them, were doing fairly unpleasant things with their expenses, i.e. claiming for things, properties they didn't own, claiming for things they hadn't spent, grossly inflating their expenses. The expenses scandal was one of the other impetuses of the Recall Act. So cheating on your expenses, being sent to prison, being censured by the Committee on Standards in Public Life, the Speaker could say, right, we're going to have a petition. The Speaker grants in that constituency a petition. the petition, I think, has to take 10 weeks. I'll check on that. 10 weeks, or is it? One certainly gets to get 10% of the electorate. If in that time people can vote, very much in the same basis as they vote in ordinary elections, but this time it's a petition. If the petition garners or gets 10% of the local people, then you trigger a by-election. Now, by-elections are those individual elections that take place in constituencies when an MP dies or retires or resigns. But this time it would be triggered by the Speaker granting a petition, the petition getting 10% of the electors, and off you have a by-election. When it was introduced, it is controversial. I mean, if you think about that, what do you think about that system? Right away, you might want to pause for a moment and think about that. It can't be initiated from below. So it isn't what most people would think about people power. It's not really people power at all. In the sense that it's at the discretion of the Speaker. So you might just think of it as a very weak system. And a lot of critics at the beginning said, this is hardly ever going to be used, is it? I mean, how many MPs are sent to prison? How many MPs are now going to cheat on their expenses after the expenses scandal? That would be daft. Well, actually, it's been used 4 times. It has resulted in the removal, directly or indirectly, of 3 MPs. And 1 has survived the process. Well, so critics said it wouldn't be used. It has been used. Critics could still say, yeah, but 4, 2015 till now, 4 people. I mean, it's not exactly the same. It's not what you might think of as holding MPs to account. On the other hand, you might say, well, if you look at the American example, and what might take place if people could genuinely remove MPs for not being the kind of MP we wanted, wouldn't the danger be that powerful pressure groups would simply orchestrate a campaign to remove an MP as soon as they're elected? That could be what happened to Gray Davis, the Californian governor. It could be what's happening to Gavin Newsom. In other words, Gavin Newsom is being seen as handling the COVID crisis badly. Well, you know, he could argue, well, look around the world. I mean, handling an unforeseen massive global disaster badly. I mean, I'm doing the best I can, kind of thing, given the hand I've been dealt. And he might well think of it as actually an attempt by the Republicans to simply remove a Democrat, and any pretext will do. Governments will face situations they can't deal with. They will often come through crises. And if in the midst of that crisis you say, well, let's get rid of them, we don't think they're doing a very good job. Would there have been certain points in the last year or two during the COVID crisis when you might have wanted to kick them out for messing up or not doing things as quickly? You might well do. That's particularly, so banking crises or others might lead you to blame individual politicians. Well, so, and they might, this removal of MPs might come from powerful, rich pressure groups or media campaigns. So the critics of Recall are going to say, you're handing the possibility of removing MPs to pressure groups, to money, to moneyed interests, and to the media, which is controlled largely by moneyed interests. And not giving politicians the chance to govern over a longer period of time. They need a freedom, a period. MPs need to be able to say, well, I was elected promising to do this, but now I'm in power, I don't really support that anymore because the world changed. As John Maynard Keynes says, when the facts change, I change my mind. Should we hold politicians to account to that extent? So it might be praised, the 2015 Recall Act, as a modest, very British kind of reform. It takes it achieves something of what it was aimed to do, and it might be criticised as being uninspiring and not people power that it might have been hoped to. Okay, let's finish this first lesson on, or first video, sorry, first video in the second lesson on how to improve democracy, ways of improving democracy. So we're heading towards the big way of improving democracy is voting systems. So before we got there, we've looked at recall elections. So we're done with that. Now, in 2006, the coalition government, again this coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberals, who were very, very enthusiastic for constitutional reform and for improving democracy. Another improvement in 2006, another experiment in a way, was E-Petitions. So basically, if you get 100,000 signatures together and submit them to Parliament online, and these are verified by a petitions committee, then this will receive a response from the government or a debate in Parliament, or both. Well, when it was originally conceived, I guess, a lot of people imagined something maybe more straightforward than that 100,000 signatures would result in a debate in Parliament and a response from the government. Now that isn't the case. Critics of the E-Petition suggest that most of them don't result in a debate, and quite often don't result in a response from the government either. And that's because in the original legislation for the E-Petitions and the setting up of the Petitions Committee, the government had a good deal of discretion if they felt the matter had already been dealt with, or if they felt the matter was, under a number of criteria, not possible to, or basically a waste of time. But for defenders of the E-Petitions system, it's a way of giving the government a bit of a prod. It's raising an issue. It creates a headline in the press. It might get a soundbite from an MP talking about it, should it result in a debate. Now the debates, I think, it's rare for it to result in a full debate in the House of Commons, although they have, and some notable ones, particularly, say, releasing the records over the Hillsborough football disaster. There have been some fairly big, notable debates in the House of Commons when governments have responded. Largely the debates take place in the Grand Committee Room, which is a smaller debating chamber, and they are largely, to be honest, ignored by the press. So you can, if you go to the E-Petitions committee site, you can see there's an awful lot of petitions that you've never heard of. I mean, and you may or may agree or disagree with them. They're submitted to the committee and result in not much publicity. But they might result in some publicity, they might result in the government getting a sort of nudge, and the government responds. So it's a bit like, it's almost evolving into a system rather than an E-Petition resulting in parliamentary debates. What it mostly seems to result in is a kind of way in which 100,000 people can get together to ask the government a question, do something about. So for instance, a recent E-Petition, 100,000 signatures, they debate the thought the government should ban the dumping of sewage into watercourses. Now, when you read that, you might say, what? Would we dump sewage into watercourses? Well, yes, actually, largely, but in the year 2000, at the turn of the century, that was Britain's primary means of disposing of sewage, was to dump it at sea untreated or dump it in rivers untreated. Largely, that isn't the case now, but still, our sewage system, a great topic, isn't it? Our sewage system in this country involves overspill going into rivers and and therefore quite a lot of untreated sewage going into rivers and offshore into coastal waters, especially if the sewage system, which is fairly old in this country, often dating to Victorian times, is overwhelmed. Now the government's response obviously was we don't want to dump sewage in rivers, we can't ban it immediately because it takes a long time to put the infrastructure in to stop that happening. For instance, in London, the Tideway Tunnel was commissioned in 2014 and it won't be finished until 2025, which should stop London sewage going into the Thames, which it still does if there's a sort of overspill. All I'm illustrating here is that popular demands for immediate government action often result in the government simply saying, yeah, we kind of agree with that, but it's going to take our time. But it has served the purpose of alerting us and reminding the government that there's a popular demand for this to be taken seriously and to be expedited quickly. So as a voice for the people, it's worked really rather well. As an instrument of directing people's concerns into immediate action, well, that would to some extent be contrary to a parliamentary system. And the parliamentary system is to prevent exactly that happening. In other words, people's desires have to be sort of filtered through Parliament, since Parliament takes into account practical considerations, financial considerations, and the considerations of minorities. And of course, any petition system that could directly translate the majority will into immediate government action would open up the possibility of the tyranny of the majority, which is probably, again, not what the parliamentary system is designed. Expressly what the parliamentary system, to some extent, its great strength, designed to prevent. Okay, the next video we'll start looking at voting systems, and we'll move ahead to some other improvements, such as whether or not voting systems should include votes for 16-year-olds or compulsory voting.